Abraham and King Abimelech. Chapter 4 of Polygamy in the Bible. Art not thou our God, who didst drive out the inhabitants of this land before thy people Israel and gavest it to the seed of Abraham thy friend forever? 2 Chron 20:7. Many prophets have given several different descriptions of Abraham, but the most commonly known are those that describe him as a friend of God and the father of the faithful. For these reasons his life should be significant to everyone, but it is especially important to us because he was a polygamist. Abraham's father, Terah, was living in Ur of the Chaldees, beyond the Euphrates, when Abraham was born, which was 400 years after the flood, in an era that was still struggling through a pioneering stage from that devastating episode. Most of the people were living in conditions that were not much more than tribal communities, located in the more favorable and fertile lands. The world in general was again sinking into idolatry and wickedness, but Abraham was somewhat protected from these allurements of sin, and he avoided the practice of worshipping these idols of stone and wood. According to the book of Jasher, Abraham spent 39 years in the 24 house of Noah, and also became well acquainted with Shem. It further says that Abram knew the Lord from 3 years old, and he went in the ways of the Lord until the day of his death, as Noah and his son Shem had taught him. Jasher 9:6. According to Hebrew tradition, Shem was none other than Melchizedek, the great king and priest of Salem. Melchizedek was a true picture of a patriarchal and priestly person. He was the earth's oldest living man at that time, and it was he that gave Abraham his priesthood authority. When Abraham's father Terah died, Abraham was 75 years old with another 100 years to live. About this time Abraham received a decisive revelation from God in which the Lord said, "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will shew thee." General 12:1. It was also in this revelation that the Lord made several other very consequential promises to him. They are listed here: that God would guide and bless him, that God would lead him to a new land, that God would make a great nation of him, that his name would be great, that God would bless those that blessed him, that God would curse those that cursed him. Through him, all the nations would be blessed. It would be difficult for Abraham to raise a family or accomplish God's mission in the conditions and influences of a place like Haran. It was here that people worshipped handmade gods of wood and stone. 25. So, Abraham set out on his journey to Sichem, which was in the land of Canaan. Again the Lord appeared unto him and gave him further instructions and promised blessings. From here he continued to a mountain between Bethel and Hay where he built an altar to the Lord. There was a famine in this land, so he continued south to Egypt. As they were about to enter the country, Abraham advised his wife, Sarai, to claim she was his sister since Pharaoh was a polygamist, and would undoubtedly want to take such a beautiful woman as one of his wives. The Lord intervened, and Pharaoh eventually learned the truth and returned Sarai to Abraham. A similar experience took place years later in Gerar, a country south of Palestine. Abraham learned that their king, Abimelech, was also a polygamist and knew that he, too, would probably want to add her to his harem. In such an event, he feared for his life and thought in order to provide safety to his family and himself, he would say that she was his sister. They met the king and sure enough he did choose her for another of his wives. But this king, unlike most men, was really an upright individual who had no intention of doing anything wrong. Neither was his polygamy like many harems gathered by other potentates of the East, as we know them. Dr. Martin Luther observed this by making the following comments. The Jews relate that, according to royal custom, Sarah was not brought to the king immediately but was kept under guard for a time. We read about the Persian king, 26 Ahasuerus Esther 2:2-3, that the maidens whom the king wanted were not brought to the king immediately but were anointed with oil of myrrh for 6 entire months, then for 6 more months with other perfumes, and at last were brought to the bed of the king. But if the Egyptian kings also followed this custom, The restraint of those heathen must have been great, not to be carried away headlong by their violent lust, as is the case among us. The sovereigns of the Greeks and the Romans allowed themselves to be carried away completely by their lusts. The morals of the Egyptians were more virtuous, and their decency greater, than among the other nations, for although polygamy was permitted among them, they appear to have lived more chastely than those who observed monogamy. Similarly, King Abimelech of the Palestinians decrees the death penalty, to keep Rebekah from being ravished. General 26 hours and 11 minutes. These facts prove that although there was polygamy, the decency of those nations was extraordinary. Luther's works. 2. 305. Luther mentioned another famous lady who married a king in polygamy. We read how this king, Ahasuerus, loved Esther more than all the women of his household. Esther was a Jewess and she went through a period of waiting and purification, being anointed with oil of myrrh and with sweet odors with other things for the purification of women. Esther 2:12. This preparation or purification period lasted for 12 months, before she married him. Anne, 27, became his queen. It was through Esther and her polygamous marriage that God brought about the miracle that saved all the Jews in his kingdom from being killed. It was the custom of these kings to bestow many gifts and valuable treasures, which was no small favor to the new wives. It was considered in the best taste for these kings to make such an endowment upon a woman who would become one of their wives. These kings were honorable men, too, and nearly any woman would be flattered at such an offer to be his queen, for they could hardly do any better. But returning to the account of Abraham and Sarah, the great king Abimelech was not in a hurry for his wedding to Sarah, which dispels the idea that it was just a lustful or temporary passion that persuaded him to the marriage. He was following the tradition of the kings of that time, and was adhering to the waiting and preparation period. This gives us the first hint that King Abimelech was an honorable man. The English historian, Patrick, noted that Abimelech was a man of great virtue in those days, not an idolater, but a worshipper of the true God, as Melchizedek the high priest. We will soon discover that this was true. It was in the midst of this joyous wedding preparation that a series of great plagues fell upon this noble pharaoh and his kingdom. Poor Abimelech didn't know what hit him. We will notice that he must have been a righteous man because he went right to God to know why such a thing was happening to his kingdom. Proof of his righteousness was in the fact that he was able to get an answer back from God. 28. God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said, "Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife." General 23. This clearly indicates the law against adultery, or the taking of another man's wife. It was a sin that was to be punished with death. Consider this situation carefully. Abimelech had a wife or wives already, and now was preparing to take Sarah as another. This is polygamy. Yet this good man went to the Lord and said, "In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this." General 25. How could he enter into polygamy with innocence and integrity if it was a sin? The Lord answered him and said, "Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart." The Lord did not chastise him for his polygamy, or his polygamist intentions, but rather that he was taking Sarah, who was a man's wife. Abimelech's answer to the Lord in his own defense was, "Said he not unto me, She is my sister, and she, even she herself said, He is my brother." General 25. Abimelech also told the Lord, "Wilt thou slay also a righteous nation?" Which is evidence that the people of his kingdom were a righteous people. This is certainly a credit to himself as a king, for he was the one who governed the people and made the laws. Nevertheless, the Lord gave the king the answers to his questions, and this good king immediately set out to correct the problem. The king went to Abraham and wanted to know why he did not tell him that Sarah was his wife. When the matter was cleared up, Pharaoh bestowed servants, gifts, and 1,000 pieces of silver to Abraham. Then the king said, "Behold, my land is before thee, dwell where it pleaseth thee." for such. 29. Goodness Abraham prayed to the Lord to bless King Abimelech, which he did, by restoring everything as it was. Also, the king would continue to have children again, for the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech. So Abraham dwelt in the land of Gerar and became a rich man, with a new understanding of King Abimelech and the principle of plural marriage.